From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
The Commission has found reasonable grounds to believe that Israeli security forces committed serious violations of human rights and international humanitarian law.
A United Nations inquiry has found Israeli forces may have committed war crimes and crimes against humanity by targeting unarmed protesters in Gaza last year, when Israeli forces killed at least 183 people and injured over 23,000 during weekly protests.
We're saying that they have intentionally shot children, they've intentionally shot people with disabilities, they've intentionally shot journalists, knowing them to be children, people with disabilities and journalists. That some of the children, not all of the children are visibly children perhaps, but many of them are.
We'll speak with Sarah Hussein, who helped conduct the UN inquiry, and Norman Finkelstein, author of Gaza, an inquest into its martyrdom. Then an undocumented immigrant is detained in Florida just weeks after he appeared in an acclaimed film at the Sundance Film Festival about activists infiltrating for-profit immigrant detention jails. Is this a form of retaliation? We look at the stunning new film, The Infiltrators, with the film's director and two activists who portray themselves in the documentary narrative hybrid film.
I mean, every little tiny bit of this action was very planned to use the system against itself in a way that other folks can replicate. And that's what, for me personally, I think this project and this film and everything can really be a flair for a lot of folks who may lack the creativity, the energy, or to know that we can do more than sort of like resist right now.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. House Judiciary Chair Jerrold Nadler is expected to request documents from over 60 people and groups tied to President Trump and his businesses today, as his committee investigates potential obstruction of justice and other crimes by the president and his allies. Congressional probes will look into some of Trump's closest business partners, including Alan Weisselberg, the CFO of the Trump Organization, Trump's son, Donald Trump Jr., as well as the Justice Department. This is Congressmember Nadler on ABC This Week.
It's very clear that the president obstructed justice. It's very clear. 1,100 times he referred to the Mueller investigation as a witch hunt. He tried to, he tried to protect Flynn from being investigated by the FBI. He fired Comey in order to stop the Russian thing, as he told NBC News.
Nadler's statements come as other Democratic committees have also indicated they're investigating Trump on multiple fronts. House Oversight Chair Elijah Cummings said last week he would like to question Weisselberg and Trump's children as well, and the House Ways and Means Committee is reportedly planning to request Trump's past tax returns. Meanwhile, Trump spoke for over 2 hours at CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference in National Harbor, Maryland, Saturday, railing against Mueller's investigation into his 2016 campaign. He said, quote, "You put the wrong people in a couple of positions and they leave people for a long time that shouldn't be there, and all of a sudden they're trying to take you out with bull." He used the word. Kentucky Senator Rand Paul has indicated he would vote in favor of a measure blocking Trump's emergency declaration, which seeks to divert billions of federal dollars to build a wall on the U.S.-Mexico border. Last week, Republican Senators Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, and Tom Tillis said they'll join their Democratic colleagues to vote in favor of the bill. Paul's vote would provide the Senate with the one-vote majority needed in order to pass the resolution. Lawmakers in the House passed a resolution last week blocking Trump's national emergency. However, neither the House or the Senate have enough votes at this point to override a presidential veto, which Trump has vowed to use. A group of 29 Central American parents have entered the U.S. at its border with Mexico Saturday and are now being processed by immigration officials after the group demanded an opportunity to be reunited with their children who are in the United States. The parents, who come from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, were separated from their children last year because of the Trump administration's family separation policy and were then deported back to their home countries. The families are asking to be reunited and for their asylum claims to be reconsidered. The parents were accompanied by religious leaders and immigrant rights groups who are providing them with legal services. This is one of the parents in the group from Honduras.
My son is at a detention center in Texas. He has been detained there in a foster home for 11 months, and they have not been able to hand him over because my nephew, who lives in the United States, does not have his papers in order. That is why.
There is a risk who will be detained in the United States. Is it worth it?
We all run the risk, but we would do anything for our children.
The Republican Party of West Virginia has come under fire after an Islamophobic poster linking Minnesota Congressmember Ilhan Omar to the 9/11 attacks was seen at a Republican event at the state capitol Friday. The poster shows the attack on the World Trade Center with the words, "Never forget," you said, above the photo. Below is a photo of Congressmember Omar, who was one of the first 2 Muslim women elected to Congress last November, with the words, "I am the proof you have forgotten," written underneath her photo. The West Virginia House of Delegates condemned the poster and said it was investigating the matter. The House's principal law enforcement official, Ann Lieberman, resigned after a delegate accused her of calling all Muslims terrorists. Omar responded to the poster via Twitter Friday, writing, quote, "No wonder why I'm on the hit list of a domestic terrorist, and assassinate Ilhan Omar is written on my local gas stations. Look no further. The GOP's anti-Muslim display likening me to a terrorist rocks in state capitals, and no one is condemning them." The U.S. and South Korea have canceled their upcoming annual joint military exercises in a move that's likely to ease tensions with North Korea, which views the exercises as a provocation. The move comes days after the highly anticipated summit between President Trump and Kim Jong-un fell apart without a deal or any substantial progress made on dismantling North Korea's nuclear arsenal. The U.S. and South Korea will instead engage in much smaller scale and less publicized drills. Trump said canceling the massive military exercises will save the U.S. hundreds of millions of dollars. As tensions between India and Pakistan appear to stabilize over the weekend, ground fighting on Friday and Saturday killed at least 5 civilians and 2 soldiers in the disputed Indian-administered region of Kashmir, according to local reports. Some residents of Pakistani border towns in the line of fire fled, heaving shelling in the area, seeking safety in nearby makeshift shelters. On Friday, the pilot of a downed Indian aircraft was released by Pakistan in an effort to ease tensions between the 2 nuclear powers after India carried out airstrikes inside Pakistan Tuesday for the first time since 1971. Pakistan resumed some flights over the weekend after temporarily shutting down its airspace last week, with a full resumption of flights expected from today. In the West Bank, Israeli forces shot 3 Palestinians after a car reportedly rammed into an Israeli military vehicle Monday near the city of Ramallah. Israeli reports said 2 Palestinians involved in the car ramming were killed by Israeli fire, while a 3rd Palestinian was injured. Venezuelan opposition leader, self-proclaimed interim President Juan Guaido, announced he will return to Venezuela after visiting several Latin American nations over the past week to rally support for his leadership and the ousting of sitting President Nicolas Maduro. Guaido, who risks arrest upon his return, has called for fresh protests against the Venezuelan government. In a Washington Post interview Sunday, Guaido said his arrest by Maduro's government would amount to a coup d'etat. In Algeria, protests continue over the weekend after embattled President Abdelaziz Bouteflika's campaign confirmed he would be running for a 5th term. A representative for Bouteflika filed the official paperwork Sunday, despite elections rules stating a candidate must file in person. The ailing leader, who's been in power since 1999 but has rarely been seen in recent years, said he would not serve his full term if elected and would schedule new elections next year. Algerians have been taking to the streets to call for Bouteflika to end his presidency for the past 2 weeks. Police used tear gas and water cannons to disperse demonstrators in the capital, Algiers. In Oakland, California, teachers and students are set to return to the classroom today after union members approved a new contract ending the 7-day strike, with teachers demanding fair wages, smaller class sizes, and more resources for their students. The deal includes an 11% salary raise and a one-off 3% bonus. Some educators are warning the fight is far from over, though, as the deal only includes a 5-month moratorium on school closures, but many worry these could resume after this time limit. The school district is also voting on further budget cuts to Oakland schools. In related news, a member of the district's school board apologized Sunday after video of her apparently grabbing a kindergarten teacher on a picket line by the neck went viral over the weekend. In more news from California, protesters took to the streets of Sacramento over the weekend after the county's district attorney announced Saturday that 2 police officers who shot and killed 22-year-old unarmed African-American Stephon Clark in his grandmother's backyard last year will not face criminal charges. Police were responding to a vandalism complaint when they saw Clark. They initially claimed he was holding a gun, but later admitted they found only a cell phone near his body. After officers unleashed 20 bullets into Clark, they waited for over 5 minutes before approaching him to administer medical attention. On Saturday, independent Vermont Senator 2020 hopeful Bernie Sanders officially kicked off his presidential run in his hometown of Brooklyn, New York. Senator Sanders addressing a crowd of thousands at his alma mater, Brooklyn College.
Our government will be based on justice, on economic justice, on social justice, on racial justice, on environmental justice. Today, I welcome you to a campaign which tells the powerful special interests who control so much of our economic and political life that we will no longer tolerate the greed of corporate America and the billionaire class.
Senator Sanders offered a more personal glimpse into his life than at previous rallies. He spoke of his father coming to the U.S. to escape anti-Semitism in Europe, where the Holocaust claimed the lives of many of his family, and of growing up in a working-class family in New York. Sanders also spoke out against institutional inequality and the need for criminal justice reform, and renewed calls from his 2016 campaign for a $15 minimum wage, Medicare for all, and free public college tuition. He was introduced by Sean King. In other 2020 election news, former Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper announced today he will seek the Democratic nomination for president. Hickenlooper served as the mayor of Denver before becoming governor. Hickenlooper oversaw a number of progressive policies in Colorado, including the legalization of marijuana. In 2017, he led a bipartisan effort with Ohio Republican Governor John Kasich to stop the repeal of the Affordable Care Act. He's been criticized by environmentalists for his relationship with the fossil fuel industry. In November, Hickenlooper stood against Proposition 112 in the midterm elections, which would have required companies to place new wells at least 2,500 feet from homes, schools, waterways, and other areas designated as vulnerable. Hickenlooper joins a crowded field of 14 Democratic candidates and is the second governor to enter the race following Washington Governor Jay Inslee's announcement last week. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. A United Nations inquiry has found Israeli forces may have committed war crimes and crimes against humanity by targeting unarmed children, journalists, and the disabled in Gaza. The report released by the UN Human Rights Council Thursday looked at Israel's bloody response to weekly Great March of Return demonstrations launched by Palestinians in Gaza nearly a year ago, targeting Israel's heavily militarized separation barrier. The report found Israeli forces have killed 183 Palestinians, almost all of them with live ammunition. The dead included 35 children. 23,000 people were injured, including over 6,000 shot by live ammunition. Santiago Canton chaired the UN Commission.
The Commission has found reasonable grounds to believe that Israeli security forces committed serious violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. These violations clearly warrant criminal investigation and prosecution, and we call on Israel to conduct meaningful investigations into these serious violations and to provide timely justice and reparations for those killed and injured.
Another member of the UN Independent Commission, Sarah Hussein, described how Israeli forces targeted civilians and journalists in Gaza.
We are saying that they have intentionally shot children, they've intentionally shot people with disabilities, they've intentionally shot journalists, knowing them to be children, people with disabilities and journalists. Some of the children, not all of the children are visibly children perhaps, but many of them are, as Commissioner Murungi just said. The journalists were all marked with press vests that we investigated, and the people with disabilities, as I said, a person, a double amputee in a wheelchair, a person using crutches, they were visibly that, and they're being shot at by snipers who also have spotters available with them, who have very high level technology available to see who's out there in the field.
The UN report called on nations to arrest, quote, persons alleged to have committed or ordered to have committed the international crimes, unquote, or to seek their extradition. The UN also demanded Israel immediately lift the blockade on Gaza. Israel's acting foreign minister dismissed the report as theater of the absurd. However, grieving Palestinians welcomed the report, including Rayada Ayub, whose teenage son Mohammed was killed during the Gaza protests.
We are happy that someone is supporting Gaza's children, and we are happy that they are supporting us to defend Gaza's children and youth in Gaza against the crimes committed by the occupation.
The UN report was issued Thursday. The same day, Israel's Attorney General announced Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is facing an indictment on charges of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. For more, we're joined by two guests. Sarah Hussein is a member of the UN Independent Commission that led the Gaza investigation. She's also a barrister practicing in the Supreme Court of Bangladesh. She joins us from Dhaka, Bangladesh. And here in New York, scholar Norman Finkelstein, author of many books, including Gaza, an inquest into its martyrdom. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Sarah Hussein, let's begin with you. Tell us about the most significant findings of your report and how this report came into being.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that.
Please explain the findings of the report.
Sure. I mean, this report was commissioned as basis of a resolution by the Human Rights Council. And accordingly, we've conducted investigations for about 6 months now with trained investigators and a team of experts. I should mention we haven't been given access to Gaza or to Israel, which obviously has hampered us quite considerably. But nevertheless, we have been able to interview witnesses. We have been able to interview many victims as well, some in person and some remotely. We've also been able to gather an extraordinary amount of documentary material, including video and drone footage, social media content, as well as all of the affidavits and other testimonies. So based on that, we've come to our assessment.
And talk about the most significant findings.
The most significant, I think, is just the number of killings and the numbers of injuries. There are 183 Palestinians who've been killed in the course of the period that we have investigated, which is from the 30th of March to the 31st of December. As you know, the demonstrations are continuing and killings and injuries have continued to be reported, but we've just covered this particular period. We also found, as you said, over 6,000 injuries to Palestinians caused by live fire. We found that 4 Israeli soldiers had been injured during this time, and 2 Israeli soldiers had also been killed, but both of those were outside the particular parameters of the investigation. They weren't in the context of, they weren't at the protest sites, although one of them was within the protest times. And I think amongst the numbers of killings, what we also found, which was a great concern, was the fact that protected groups who are protected categories in international law, protected persons such as children, people with disabilities, and also health workers and journalists were amongst those who were both killed and injured in large numbers.
The UN report calls on states to arrest persons alleged to have committed or who ordered to have committed the international crimes. What exactly does that mean?
Well, our investigation is done according to the standard of reasonable grounds to believe. It's not a criminal investigation. We have made some preliminary findings based on the facts as we found them, and applying international human rights law and international humanitarian law where that was relevant, given that we're speaking about the context of an occupation and in the context, in certain contexts, the conduct of hostilities. So we've made these findings, but we believe that these need to be taken further. We've called on Israel itself to conduct investigations. We understand that Israel has opened at least 5 investigations into the incidents that we've found, but we are not clear why it has not opened a larger number of investigations. We think that's the first thing that should happen. We've also asked for the international community to look into this. We're going to present our findings, hand them over to the High Commissioner for Human Rights of the United Nations, and I think then it's for other bodies to take this further.
I want to go to acting Israeli Foreign Minister.
Process at the International Criminal Court.
I want to go to the acting Israeli Foreign Minister Yisrael Katz responding to the UN Human Rights Council's report.
This report is another chapter in the theater of the absurd, produced occasionally by the United Nations Human Rights Council, another hostile, mendacious, and slanted report against the State of Israel. It's a report based on distorted information in which the facts were not at all checked, whose only purpose is to slander the only democracy in the Middle East and harm our right to self-defense in the face of the terrorism of a murderous organization. The State of Israel outright rejects this report.
Norm Finkelstein, the significance of Israel saying it rejects the report.
Well, Israel has always rejected the reports, whether they come from the United Nations or, more often than not, they come from reputable human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, or the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem. So it's not as if, to use the words of the person you just had on, it's not as if it's a typically mendacious UN report. It's a report that falls in line with the findings of every reputable human rights organization.
What most struck you about this report?
What most struck me about the report was it was remarkably honest. It was very forthright in its conclusions, and it didn't fake this kind of balance which most human rights organizations, even reputable ones, attempt between Israel and the United States. So just to take a couple of examples, it forthrightly stated that Israel targets intentionally children during these demonstrations. It targets reporters. It targets medical personnel. That's unusual. Allow me just 2 examples which you would be familiar with. So when there was the killings during Operation Protective Edge of the 4 children who were playing hide and seek.
This was back in 2014.
In 2014. Recently, The Intercept had an article on those 4 killings of the 4 kids, and had the story that they weren't really intentionally killed. It was an accident. It was a mistake. And same thing with the New York Times when it had the big story on Razan al-Najjar, which was quoted everywhere. The essence of the story was there was this Israeli sniper's bullet. It hit the ground, ricocheted, and then accidentally hit 3 Israeli medical personnel. It was a magic bullet because there was a huge crowd of people, but this magic bullet only hit 3 medical personnel. But this human rights report by the Human Rights Council, it's very straightforward. It says intentionally targets children, intentionally targets even disabled persons. And that to me was a credit to them, that there was no fake balance. If you look at the proportions, when it looks at the damages done to the people of Gaza, they devote 10 full pages. And then there's a section called Impact on Israel. It's 3 paragraphs. And that's exactly what the reality shows, that overwhelmingly, in fact, virtually entirely, all the infliction of death and destruction is on the Palestinian side. There were, for the period they covered, during the demonstrations, there were no fatalities during the demonstrations, and 4 Israeli soldiers were lightly injured. These are massacres. They're not conflicts. They're not engagements. They're just outright massacres of overwhelmingly unarmed, nonviolent demonstrators.
This report comes out as the Attorney General of Israel says he's going to indict the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. The significance of this?
Well, the Israelis ignore the reports. So in that context, it's not significant. However, there is a critical significance. Namely, the International Criminal Court has had now two cases referred to it on the situation among the Palestinians. One case is on the Mavi Marmara, the flotilla in 2010 that came under Israeli attack. And the second case is on Israeli war crimes in the West Bank, mostly the settlements, and Operation Protective Edge in Gaza. Now, the Chief of Staff during Operation Protective Edge during July-August 2014, the Israeli Chief of Staff was Gantz. I guess his first name is Benny, but I could be mistaken, Gantz. And the fact of the matter is, if Netanyahu is out, Gantz will probably be the prime minister, and he will be up for indictment by the International Criminal Court. The chief prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, is desperately trying not to investigate Israeli war crimes, but within the International Criminal Court, there's been an unprecedented pushback. There are large numbers of members of the ICC who say it's time to indict Israel. And the pressure, because of this report, the pressure on Bensouda, Chief Prosecutor Bensouda, is going to be enormous. It's time to indict Israel.
And just to be clear, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, if indicted, as the Attorney General says, is not being indicted for this, but for corruption.
That's correct. It's sort of like I said, it's sort of like Al Capone being indicted for tax evasion. In the great scheme of things, that was the least of Capone's crimes, but that's the way the judicial system works.
Has the U.S. responded to the report?
To my knowledge, the U.S. is not. This is a preliminary report. The full report will come out on March 18th, I think. So this is sort of the what they call like an executive summary. It was 22 pages. I imagine the full report will be considerably larger.
And Sarah Hussein, what do you want to see come out of this report?
I think we'd definitely like to see some action by Israel, action by the Palestinian Authority also, and action by the international community. I just want to mention one thing, though, in terms of the findings. We did also make findings that in two of the incidents we looked at, on the 14th of May and on the 12th of October, there may have been some justification for the shootings. On the 14th of May, we found an incident in which 21 people were killed, where we think there may have been an issue of direct participation in hostilities, possibly justifying the shootings, and that requires further investigation as well. But we think that all the findings we have, as I said, we're going to take them forward. We think it's critical that with the 30th of March in front of us, the anniversary of the start of the so-called Great March of Return, it's very important that the international community take action to ensure that this death toll and this injuries toll doesn't continue. We're calling for protective monitoring to be put in place. We're calling for action to end this terrible death toll and injury toll that has been continuing over the last year and continuing even now.
Sarah Hussein, I want to thank you for being with us, member of the UN Independent Commission that led the Gaza investigation. Norman Finkelstein, author and scholar, his most recent book, Gaza, An Inquest into Its Martyrdom. We'll be back in 30 seconds. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. An immigrant rights activist has been detained in Florida just weeks after he appeared in an acclaimed film at the Sundance Film Festival about activists infiltrating and exposing for-profit immigrant detention jails. Claudio Rojas was apprehended Wednesday by Immigration and Customs Enforcement after an annual check-in. He's now being held at the Chrome Detention Center, where he faces immediate deportation. His lawyer says his arrest is linked to the film featuring his activism. It's It's called The Infiltrators. The gripping hybrid documentary dramatic feature was a smash success at Sundance, will play at the Miami Film Festival Tuesday. But Claudia Rojas will not be there to see it. Attorney Sandy Pineda told the Washington Post, quote, "I definitely think it's retaliation for them to take this stance and to just arrest him so suddenly for no apparent reason. It's very unusual," she said. The Infiltrators is based on the incredible true story of undocumented immigrants who purposefully got themselves arrested by federal authorities in order to infiltrate the Broward Transitional Center in Florida and organize the prisoners within its walls. Claudia Rojas worked with the activists on the inside. A father of two with no criminal record, he spent 7 months at Broward in 2012 after he was detained by ICE officials outside his Florida home. The scene was portrayed in The Infiltrators. It begins with a lawn care worker in Broward County, Florida.
Our inside man was Claudio Rojas. He just didn't know it yet.
My life was pretty ordinary, just like anyone else. I'd go home after work. I liked to go fishing on weekends. Family back in Argentina. I'm at the park with Liliana. Say hi, Liliana. It was a Friday morning. I woke up at 7:30 in the morning to take out the trash. I went out wearing only shorts.
At the end of that clip, we see an actor playing Claudio Rojas being ambushed by ICE officers as he takes out the trash. The Infiltrators, directed by Cristina Ibarra and Alex Rivera, features Viridiana Martinez and Marco Saavedra, young dreamers who were brought to the United States as children. As organizers with the National Immigrant Youth Alliance, Viri and Marco enter the Broward Transitional Center in 2012 and went undercover to expose conditions at the detention center and help immigrants fight deportations. They worked with activists on the outside, including Mohammed Abdullahi, a young gay undocumented Iranian immigrant. When they were arrested and jailed inside, they worked alongside Claudia Rojas, who eventually was relieved from detention after a highly publicized hunger strike. Now Claudia Rojas faces deportation once again. Well, Democracy Now! Sat down with Alex Rivera, Viridiana Martinez, and Mohammed Abdullahi this year at the Sundance Film Festival. I began by asking co-director Alex Rivera why he made the film.
Both Cristina Ibarra, my co-director, and myself, we both come from immigrant families. We have undocumented family members. And when we decided to become filmmakers, we sort of dove into border issues and immigration issues as a kind of lifelong commitment, really. I've been making work sort of in and around the question of immigration for about 20 years. But in 2010, we saw something that we'd never seen before, which was undocumented immigrants risking deportation as part of an act of political protest, doing sit-ins, blocking roads, sitting in John McCain's office, and risking deportation to sort of force a decision on behalf of the government about their status. And it was a disturbing thing to see in the news. It was shocking. And I wanted to understand it better. And so through some mutual friends, I reached out to what would become the National Immigrant Youth Alliance, to Mohammed and the group of other young undocumented folks who surrounded him or who worked with him, and said, I want to make a film. And I thought I was going to make a short film. It would be a month or two. And every time I tried to edit the film, they went and did something more interesting, more radical. And so I had to stop editing, and Cristina and I just started to kind of film and try to wrestle with what was unfolding in this moment of great activism and sort of experimentation.
Now, what's interesting is you didn't make a documentary here.
Right.
So talk about that choice.
Sure. So I filmed with the National Immigrant Youth Alliance for about 2 years. And then after that cycle of action, after they sort of, after DACA was passed and the movement kind of settled down a little bit, we looked back at the footage, and this one part of the story, which was the infiltration of the Broward Detention Center, seemed like the story that had a really fantastic kind of beginning, middle, and end. And by focusing on that one story, you could see a lot of other dynamics, a lot of other histories, a lot of other problems. And so the only problem with that, though, was that we only were able to film half of the story, meaning that we were with this activist group that was sending undocumented folks into the detention center, but once they went in, they disappeared. They disappeared from our camera, and they disappeared from their friends on the outside. And so how do you tell a story in which you can only see half of it in this visual medium. And so our solution was to work in a kind of hybrid form, where on the outside of the detention center, we're with the real people going through this real action in real time. But then when they go into the detention center, we turn them into actors. And we use wardrobe, hair, makeup, casting to try to make a kind of continuity, so you know, as a viewer, you know who you're following, but you also see there's a little difference. And so the characters go into this kind of suspended place. They're suspended in the detention center and also suspended in this sort of format of fiction. And so the two forms—
As you call it, the black box. They're entering the black box.
They enter the black box, and you feel it texturally in the film itself, that they're in this other landscape. But then in detention, they sometimes pick up the phone and call out to the documentary layer. And so both Christina and I, it's important to us as filmmakers to try to tell stories that are urgent, tell stories that are relevant to the political moment we're living in, but also to play with the form and invite an audience in to see a film that's as weird formally and as adventurous in its form as the activists were in their actions.
I'm secretly hoping that after you get your awards here at Sundance, that you turn this film into, it's kind of an immigrant version of Orange is the New Black, but we'll talk about that later. Viri Martinez, you are the real undocumented immigrant who goes into the detention center in 2012. We spoke to you in the detention center, but let's go back a little bit and talk about this decision that you made. I mean, you were risking everything. Talk about your life here, where you were born, and why you would voluntarily try to get yourself arrested or detained so that you're taken into a center that could lead to your deportation.
Yeah, well, I was born in Mexico, and I was brought here to the U.S. when I was 7 years old. And then when I graduated high school and I couldn't go to college because of my status,
You lived in?
I lived in North Carolina. That's where I grew up and everything. And so I became active in the community as a result of that background. And I started an immigrant youth-led organization in North Carolina. And then we started working on deportation cases. And by working cases, I mean we would hear that our friends were getting deported. Lots of dreamers at the time, youth that have been brought here as children and couldn't, were undocumented. And
when did you come out as undocumented? Come out publicly?
2009 was when I first came out. That was like 10 years ago, so I was like 22. Yeah.
Were you scared? Where did you make your pronouncement?
Yes, it was at this rally, actually, where somebody, I had told people my story in like settings, like private settings, but never like publicly, until we were at this rally, somebody had heard my story and they handed me a mic and they said, Viri, talk. And so I started talking about who I was and being undocumented, and that was the first time that I came out.
Were you afraid? Was ICE there?
ICE wasn't there, but the police was there, and I was definitely afraid, but I was willing to face that fear because living in the shadows was no longer an option for me.
So you became an activist.
Yes.
And talk about what you decided to do in 2012. And let's be clear, this isn't under Trump. This is under President Obama.
Yes, thank you, Amy, for clarifying that. Yeah, I decided to turn myself in and be a part of this action. When I learned that there was a women's section, Marco let us know that, and we had been, like I was explaining, we had been working with people who were facing deportation for several years at that point, and we knew that we had the ability to stop our deportation. And so even though it was a risk, I was willing to take that risk because I knew that we had the power to get me out if things went south.
Let's go right now to Marco, who was the first of the undocumented immigrants to turn himself in at the Broward Detention Center. He came on Democracy Now! Afterwards and talked about how tough this decision was and what happened.
What we found and what we've developed since we started this campaign, and I was in the center for about 23 days, was
many detainees who, as you said, qualify as low priority for deportation, including the case of Claudio Rojas, who is an Argentinian father and is now on his 17th day of his hunger strike because as an expression of his faith, but also as a statement saying that the worst has already happened to me, being separated from my family for the past 6 months, and using his body as a sacrifice, or as an example of the sacrifice that he's already endured. He's willing to do that, and because of that was separated from and was taken from Broward Transitional Center to Chrome Detention Facility in order to be removed from the other detainees that were also beginning to organize as he had begun.
But what was his story? Why is he one of the people who would be released under Obama's program?
Under the prosecutorial discretion memo, correct, as outlined in the summer of 2011, he would be a perfect candidate. He was in removal proceedings about 2 years ago when he was detained with his son after kind of a minor traffic infraction. They were trying to enter a port and they didn't have valid identification, and so they were both in detention for 3 months, and his son is DREAM Act eligible, Emiliano Rojas, and so his case was dropped, but Claudio's received 120 days to leave the country and disobeyed it because he'd rather choose to stay with his family and provide for them, and so receiving a deportation order and not obeying it, now that's the biggest thing that is really hurting his campaign for his release.
So that's Marco describing on Democracy Now!, who is featured in this film, both the reenactment of when he went inside with an actor and also himself when he gets out. Viadi, describe what happened to you. You go into where did you go?
Yeah, so my first attempt was at the Customs and Border Patrol office where Marco was able to turn himself in, and I was unsuccessful. The second attempt—
What did you say?
I said, I think the reason that I was unsuccessful is because I was dressed very nicely. I had a nice summer dress and I had makeup on, and so I just said, I think I said I want to turn myself in, but I tried to do broken English that really sounded like I was playing around because I didn't prepare. I didn't think it was going to be that difficult. And when the officer gave me this look what are you doing here? What do you want? And then he called another officer, and that's when I realized, oh, this isn't working. I'm just gonna go. Yeah, because he said, I saw you get out of the car. Who dropped you off? And so, yeah. So at that point, I just said, okay, this is the wrong place. I'm gonna go. Bye. And then we had to try again later. But in order to try again, we actually played through the role of and even I dressed differently to fit what a day laborer looks like, and sound like that. I mean, I spoke only Spanish, and then I basically had to beg.
And where did you turn yourself in then?
I turned myself in successfully the second time. It was at the Fort Lauderdale port of entry.
And what did you say? I'm not documented?
I was crying. I said that my husband had been deported, that I had been fired, that I had no job, and that I just wanted to go, and that I had nothing left here. And I just cried. And they didn't want to take me. They said, are you sure? Are you sure that you can probably do more for your family if you stay here? We can find you help, and I said, no, I don't want to be here. Please just take me. I had to beg them and cry.
And you said you're undocumented?
Yes.
Wouldn't that be enough for them to take you?
That's what you would think, right? Yeah.
For all the people who are trying not to get deported, to beg and say you're undocumented, but they ultimately took you.
Right, they ultimately did. Yes. I wasn't handcuffed at that moment. I was actually, I think they were still trying to figure out what to do and why I was begging to be deported. They transferred me to the Customs and Border Patrol facility. There they processed me again, where they pulled up actually some of my records of being arrested and other actions, other protesting stuff. But I was able to get around that by saying other stuff. So as to not say, oh yeah, I protested, that's why I have an arrest record. And then I was taken to a room for several hours until they finally drove me to Broward Transitional Center.
So describe walking into Broward and what that felt like. You were put in an orange jumpsuit?
It wasn't an orange jumpsuit that I was put in. It was actually a gray, just gray, it's like sweatpants and like sweatshirt. And it took hours for me to be processed. I mean, when I finally made it into my room in Broward, it was like 5 a.m. I turned myself in at 7 p.m. So it took hours for me to finally
describe the
get there.
detention center, who you were placed with, and then how you started to come out to, this was a women's part,
Yes.
Women's facility.
Yes.
Broward has both men and women, but you're divided?
Yes, Broward has way less women than men. There's only like up to 100 women, and there's like 600 men. So the women's area is very it's very secluded. It's one hallway with lots of rooms. I actually ended up in the same room as Maria. When I got into the room, she saw me when I got there in the morning, and she helped me do my bed and everything. And the next morning, when we went to lunch, I just started talking to her and the other girls, and I told her, yeah, we've been in touch with Maria, so with the husband of someone here, and she said, who, to tell me, and I told her, yeah, Maria Soledad, and she said, and we just looked at each other, and we were like, she was like, that's me. And I heard about this, but I didn't know that it was real, that it was really gonna happen. And she was just blown away. And I was blown away that I ended up in the same room as her. It was crazy.
Immigrant rights activist Viridiana Martinez, who stars in The Infiltrators, along with fellow activist Mohamed Abdullahi and the film's co-director, Alex Rivera. We'll be back with them in 30 seconds. Don't Fence Me In by John Diversa Big Band featuring DACA artists. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. We're looking at The Infiltrators, a new film based on the incredible true story of undocumented immigrants who purposefully got themselves arrested by federal authorities in order to infiltrate a for-profit immigrant jail in Florida. We spoke with the co-director, Alex Rivera, and the activists featured in the film, Viridiana Martinez and Mohamed Abdullahi, at the Sundance Film Festival in Park City, Utah. Talk about this coordination on the outside. Who decides to go in? Who decides to stay outside? Mo, you were born in Iran. You're undocumented. You're not even protected by DACA right now. So everything you're doing is unprotected. Viri, you now have DACA protection?
Well, yes, but I would argue DACA is not a protection. Yeah.
Why?
Because it's not. I mean, it's discretionary. The same way that I got it, I can get it taken away.
So, Mo, you decided not to go inside. You'd coordinate. And what does it mean to coordinate? And explain what information you needed from people on the inside to help them.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't go inside the Broward Detention Center because I also don't speak Spanish, one of my limitations. In terms of our outside role and how we decided how folks went in, we had really been doing deportation cases since we were advocating for the DREAM Act. And when we were advocating for the DREAM Act, we had a lot of our friends getting deported. And we learned sort of through the Obama administration how we can build support for our friends to stop their deportations. And so whenever we got to the Broward Detention Center, we had sort of figured out that we can safely get folks in to gather stories and get them out whenever the time was right. That was sort of our political calculation. The goal of Broward was, this came right after DACA. That was like the important thing for us. When DACA was announced, the folks from the National Immigrant Youth Alliance, we were occupying Obama's campaign offices. We were still sitting in offices the day after the announcement, sort of trying to tell the world that there are going to be Dreamers getting deported. This policy is not going to be executed fully. And we sort of found our voices going into the void. And so
this was 2012, when he was running for re-election, so it was all over the country happening.
Yeah, June 2012. We were sitting in the offices and we just sort of realized we were just screaming into the void. Nobody's listening to us. And that's when sort of the plan for Broward was hatched of how can we show everybody that regardless of what they say they're doing, behind the scenes, our people are actually being harmed. And so we went down to Florida. As the outside team, our role was pretty much the minute that the folks inside got access to the phone, which was like 7 a.m. until 11 p.m., they would start calling us and giving us information. So the first day that Marco got inside the detention center, that day he called us like around 8:30 in the morning, and he had a list of names and A numbers of people inside the detention center with their family contacts. So I would literally just sit there with a sketch pad. He would give me a name, A number, phone number. Name, A number, phone number. We did that over and over every single day until he was released. As the outside team, it wasn't just a few of us. We were in a sort of house in Florida with about 4 of us that were on the ground, that were the point of contact with families, getting information, helping design campaigns locally. But we had the entire backing of the National Immigrant Youth Alliance, so we had a whole team that was in Philadelphia and Michigan, Ohio, that would draft petitions. We had another group of folks that were all law students that would draft legal filings.
Now the key was, and Viri, in the film, Marco is usually doing this, but getting these prisoners to sign away their privacy rights so people could learn about their case. Did you also do that with the women?
So that's where like the trust issue comes in, and because there wasn't, I mean, there were women who did it, but there wasn't as many, and there wasn't as because of the mistrust and the, well, what if this gets me deported?
And what is the goal, though? If they sign away their privacy rights, how does that help them get out?
Because that's the only way that congressional offices agree to inquire with DHS, with Department of Homeland Security, ICE, about the status of their cases.
And Alex, is it true the way it all happened? I mean, you had Marco inside and he was getting all these documents. Somehow ICE caught on, and the GEO group, which runs the prison, and we'll talk about that in a minute, that he was handing papers to someone in the visiting room. So they said no longer could they hand papers to each other. Is that how it went?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the film is kind of a hybrid in between documentary and fiction. And in the fictional world, we sometimes synthesize and condense things. The sort of big shape of the story is based entirely on the truth. And so one of the threads in the story, it's kind of, as directors, we tried to amplify kind of a heist element to it. We sometimes called it the Ocean's 11 of immigration. We wanted to make a film that would bring in a new kind of audience for this type of a story.
So you have Mo dropping these envelopes of privacy waivers into the garbage, and some other immigrant who was pushing the garbage along would go drop it onto the floor, and the guy pushing the broom would go into the detention waiting room, pushing this broom with papers under it, and then the immigrant activists in the waiting room would pick up the document and drop other documents so that others could sign, and it would go like that.
And that's the essence of the truth, that basically these privacy waivers were an essential part of the campaign to basically turn the detention center inside out. The detention center is designed to disappear people, to make them invisible, and when they sign away their privacy rights, which sounds vulnerable, it sounds risky, but it actually is part of empowerment, letting the inside be seen by journalists and by politicians. So these papers going in and out quickly were essential to the campaign. And so as storytellers, we tried to kind of amplify that element of it.
And Mo, how many people were you able to document inside?
We had 350 folks that we were in direct contact with by the end of that 3 weeks, and we had missed probably a good 200-300 phone calls. We had about 150 active campaigns that we were directly working on, and there was about 120 folks that we saw get out on discretion.
The moments when you would call a family member on the outside were so touching, so beautiful. You talked about how important that was just to you to keep going, but describe that.
Yeah, I mean, for us, like the thought that we constantly had going in our minds as we were working on this project is, how can the system be so broken that the best hope these people have is a group of undocumented youth, have not gone to college, we're not licensed attorneys, we're not anything, and we are somehow the best hope people have. And so it was very sort of re-energizing for us to connect with other undocumented people and have them see through our actions and our working together that as undocumented folks, we can empower one another and really achieve these things. And that's what those happy moments really meant for us.
Okay, let's talk about the uprising in the courtyard. Marco is taken. Everyone is afraid he's going to be deported.
Yep.
And then this chant goes up, libertad, freedom, freedom. And everyone who had been very afraid and quiet suddenly is chanting.
Yes. Yes, I mean, I remember hearing it when I was finally taken downstairs again and put in a room, and they said, you need to change out. And I said, where's my phone? And they're like, we're not giving you that until, and I'm like, the whole time, I'm trying to get my phone because I just wanted to document stuff, but they wouldn't give it to me. So anyways, so then I start hearing, when they stick me in this room and I'm like, where's Marco? And then I start hearing the chanting and I'm like, oh God, what's going on? It was like something out of a movie. It was
meanwhile,
intense.
you're converging, Mo, you and the other undocumented activists and others, your allies, are converging on the outside of the jail, of the detention center, as the inside people are shouting libertad, freedom, freedom?
Yeah, I mean, we were, by the point Vidi and Marco were ready to get out of the detention center, we felt like we had made our point to every single guard, ICE official, et cetera, that existed in Florida, that we will go to no lengths to help our families. And yeah, so we went there to pick up.
You would go to all lengths?
We would go to all lengths and any lengths. I mean, I think for me, the real undercurrent of this action at Broward was that we wanted to send a message to the ICE officers, Border Patrol, every single time you detain somebody. Could they be an infiltrator? We don't know. And so that's really what we wanted to get across, is to get them to second guess every single action they have. I think there's, like for the media, for example, when we went public that Vidi Diano was inside and Marco was inside, we were very intentional that every single room inside of that detention center had a TV because they wanted people to just be like zombies looking at the TV. We knew that the folks that are inside are always watching certain media channels, and so we specifically worked on deals with those media outlets. I mean, every little tiny bit of this action was very planned to use the system against itself in a way that other folks can replicate. And that's what, for me personally, I think this project and this film and everything can really be a flare for a lot of folks who may lack the creativity, the energy, or to know that we can do more than sort of like resist right now. That's what message that we want this film to get to people, is that you can use every little bit of it. I think by the end of the infiltration, close to when Marco was about to get out, I mean, we were to the point where we would tell people that would call, go to room 306, pick up a blank privacy waiver, give it to room 205, and they'll deliver it to us. Like, yeah, it's easy.
Who were you able to get out? You and Marco, were you actually able to free people?
Oh yeah, I mean, this was after we got kicked out of Broward. We stayed around for 6 months. So we didn't. I didn't live in Florida prior to this. I mean, I went there specifically for this project. So we continued working for like 6 months on getting people released.
And Alex, if you could talk about where GEO fits in and where does ICE fit in? How does this work? We're talking about government and we're talking about private companies.
Sure. Yeah, so in the film, we had to sort of simplify things. So you really see a lot of the GEO Corporation in the film. The GEO Corporation owns the facility, runs it. They administer a labor program, which has been the subject of a recent lawsuit because they pay the detainees $1 a day. And the real way that they kind of compel detainees to work, to clean the floors, to wash the uniforms, to cook the food, to run the entire facility for a wage of $1 a day, the way they compel that labor is through withholding visitation rights. So if you refuse to work, you get to see your family, your loved ones once every 2 weeks. But if you participate in this basically forced labor program, then you get to see your loved ones once a week. And I remember when Marco emerged from the detention center, that was the first thing he was talking about. I think he sort of learned that inside. I learned it from him, and it was shocking. And today it is the subject of a lawsuit.
The Infiltrators co-director Alex Rivera and immigrant rights activists Viridiana Martinez and Mohamed Abdullahi. The Infiltrators will be screened at the Miami Miami Film Festival on Tuesday, and then starting Friday at South by Southwest in Austin, Texas. And that does it for the show. A very fond farewell to Ariel Boone. We will miss your passion, your dedication, your wisdom, and your puns, Punderdome star. You have made Democracy Now! So much better. I'm speaking in Denver March 15th at East High School. Check our website. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.